Now we give the stage to Mr. Pekka Pesonen, who is the Secretary-General at Coca Cogeca in the Europe, originally from Juva, quite near from North Karelia, the place I live, so the man from Eastern Finland to the European policy level. His title today is the European Rural Value Chain in 2040 from farm to fork. So please, Pekka.
So this is your title to my presentation is actually quite good in a sense that I just added the capital letters to the farm to fork, because it's at the same time it's an initiative and policy approach in general where agricultural activity on farms actually translates to added value all the way to the consumers, and we feel that this is very much of relevance. So if you go to the next slide, that would only point out the general value of European agricultural output. We have one of the biggest economic sectors, but then when I say biggest in general, that means that we have, together with other stakeholders in the agri-food chain, a huge contribution to the EU economy that actually exceeds 1 trillion euros, 1,000 billion euros, more than that every year, and out of that, approximately 177 billion euro is the added value for European agriculture. So we are part of a substantial chain that creates value for the whole of the European economy. And in fact, it was Mr. The Commissioner for Trade in Mr. Barroso's cabinet, who famously said a few years ago that European agri-food chain is the biggest economic sector of them all, bigger than chemical industry, automobile industry, or any other sector. And this is something that we quite often forget. So supplying foodstuffs to our consumers and doing that increasingly sustainably would be important also for the society. Next slide, please. I would simply point out that Europe is very good in its diversification. The pie chart that hopefully the next slide would show would actually demonstrate how many sectors we have and what is their relative size. And this is the European average. If you look at things, for instance, from Finnish perspective, you would see that the livestock sectors are, I should say, better represented in the total output, because the reality is that that in our conditions we need to develop, especially farm gate value, further with a bigger relative share of assistance of livestock sectors. But this only shows that we talk about a huge number of sectors that are active in agriculture, and we are very proud of that. It's very much of a European model. The next slide actually lists some of the key elements that we hope that you are all also personally familiar with. It is very much about food, supplying food that is sufficient in terms of volumes. Quality has to be maintained. It needs to be safe. Increasingly, we talk about the nutritional value of foodstuffs. And the big thing for us is that the quality aspect, we need to respect the fact that all consumers have their own concept on it. And the common denominator is that it is diverse. We also deliver public goods, and one of the big elements there is that unlike some of the NGOs, we also point out that food is very much about basic public good on food security. And in Europe, this is mainly about price stability, where people do not like the idea of paying more or seeing fluctuating price for the foodstuffs. And this is a kind of an outcome or a kind of a diagnosis of European agri-food chain in terms of security, that food security in European approach is about price stability in the first step. In some other parts of the world, it's actually physical access to foodstuffs. But in Europe, we at least until now, we can afford to buy our foodstuffs one way or another in general. But it's also rural jobs, but also in rural jobs outside agriculture. It's about services, it's agritourism, it's very much about services that agriculture uses, but then also services that agriculture provides to other parts of the society. And then now increasingly it comes up with the solutions for certain societal issues such as carbon sequestration, climate change, and also, of course, by definition, agriculture, forestry are very much part of what we call biodiversity in its general approach. The next slide would point out some of the political elements that what we would expect from the EU policies, that the CAP is very much the foundation of it. And it is an economic policy. And this is something that our colleagues sometimes forget. They see this as a set of policies that would have to serve some other parts of society, or at least not agriculture or farmers. But then the unfortunate thing is that all big nations and traders in the global scene actually substitute support the farmers one way or another. And that needs to be taken into account, because the sheer fact is that all nations need to sustain their own security, also food security. And the CAP is actually the basis of that policy framework for the EU. And the European Union actually provides the framework for all EU 27 member states in this respect. CAP has been very performant, which is another claim that some of our opponents hate. But then the reality is that we wouldn't have this much food diversification and the competitiveness if we didn't have the CAP and its relevant policies. It also has provided some change during the times of political reassessment. Several times during my time here in Brussels, we have had an update to the CAP, and we are doing that also in future. It is important to note that CAP now is getting into the same boat with some environmental issues such as climate change, and therefore we recognize this by strongly supporting the Paris Agreement in 2015. We in fact went to Paris to hold our Presidia meeting there in order to support the initiative, to make sure that the general public and media would understand that agriculture and forestry actually play an important role when it comes to fighting climate change. But we need to have investments. They need to be practical. They need to be geared towards the market reality. We need to employ new technologies that sometimes are controversial in the eyes of some of the consumers. But if it's safe, our competitors will use them. I just had a meeting with our colleagues from the US, and they may have a slight different view on the sustainability in terms of what is safe and what is not safe. But then we both aim at the same objective. So how to make our agricultural forestry sector more sustainable, and how to serve the consumer market in an increasingly open international trading environment. And it's important to note that we actually have less funds available from the public sources. So we are very happy to see some additional funds from the next generation of EU funds to be put in agriculture, 7.5 billion, in fact, during the current planning phase of the Union. But even if we take this into account, we will have a decline in our overall real terms contribution from the taxpayers to agriculture. So therefore, importantly, we need to develop market-based solutions, not only for some issues like I mentioned, foodstuffs, and also climate change, biodiversity, but also when it comes to the wider rural economic context. And this is why we see so important these investments, because the investments in rural value chains would also create added value for the rural economy that we desperately need. So therefore, we see a very strong link, for instance, in having proper access to internet, broadband, which actually may serve also the agricultural need. But importantly, it gives an opportunity for city dwellers, people that don't necessarily have anything to do with agriculture or even rural areas, the first place, to go to the rural constituencies, rural small villages, small towns, and do their work if they can from these locations. So we see a very strong link in the synergies there. And especially in Finland, we have experienced this during the COVID-19 period. But in the next slide, I would point out that what is missing. And this is forgive me for taking a bit of an agricultural point of view here, but then once again, it's very much linked with the rural economy. And the big question is that, yes, we may agree on the objective, we may agree on the principles, for instance, in the European Green Deal, but let us have the tools how to make it successful, how to make the Green Deal work. And in this respect, I'm very disappointed to say that the European Commission, in its Green Deal approach and proposal from May last year, actually didn't give that commitment. So basically, agriculture, in particular, some other economic sectors also in the rural areas affected, they were told that we are going to put these objectives in place and you figure out what to do with them. And this is not acceptable from the rural community and especially agriculture perspective, because we need to have not only the financial support, but we need to have preferably European Union authorization to certain policies, certain technologies, certain approaches, for instance, in the value chain, and in particularly, for instance, in trade, that would actually make us compatible to those objectives and actually would help us to reach for that environmental sustainability that seems to be so important for us all, also for farmers. The big element is that we need to find these diverse ways to deal with it. And even in the case of Finland, I see a huge range of issues that we need to employ at the same time. European Union truly is united in its diversity. And this is also the case at national level. Quite importantly, already last year in May 2020, we asked the Commission to come up with a comprehensive impact assessment in order to figure out what the consequences of these sustainability initiatives would be to agriculture. And I'm very disappointed to point out that the Commission absolutely refused to come up with it. They pointed out that we are going to do this in each of these policy initiatives separately. But that's the whole point. The political initiative that was probably one of the biggest initiatives in the European Union history, European Green Deal, lacked assessment how that would work on the ground and amongst the farming community or rural dwellers that actually are supposed to put it in practice. And now, only more than a year after the publication of the Green Deal, the European Commission came up with the first assessment or study. It wasn't an impact assessment, but Joint Research Centre published in early August a study where they basically said that we are going to have substantial decrease of the output and the economic consequences will be dire to agriculture. We knew it, but then once again, importantly, we asked for the European Union and the European Commission to give us the tools. Like, if this is going to be the consequence, if we didn't do anything, let us know and give us the tools how we offset and make sure that the rural communities, agriculture, forestry can actually work for the big objectives that we support. And this was by far the biggest missing link. And especially when we look at the rural policies and affecting our rural economy, the importance of the cohesion or the consistency between different supporting mechanisms, European structural funds, InvestEU, and Union Recovery Program that I mentioned earlier, is really important to analyze. And therefore, the rural policies need to be very much at the heart of the same assessment on how the policy would impact us. And that is a big failure of the European Union. We have been seeing outside bodies like US Department of Agriculture, and now in August, early August, our Joint Research Centre coming up with a study. We have seen several European associations working on various studies that all point to the same direction. We will have a major hurdle ahead of us. We will have a major economic challenge if we didn't take this into account in assessing what can be done in order to offset that. We need investment. We need rural policies coherence. We need to make sure that we actually can deliver. And by doing so, we would sustain those millions and millions of people, families, small businesses that actually make a living out of the rural economy and especially in our natural resources. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pekka, for your strong words. I think many of us agree. There would be time for one question if you have somebody from the audience. If you're quick, there is something on the chat. Wait a second. One question from my point, I think today is a nice, there are a lot of different kind of people from different organizations, from different stakeholders, and I think the way to create a future is to think the practicalities together, how to reach the goal. So do you have suggestions, for example, thinking about the farmers we have here online, that what kind of actions in a practical level you would recommend, or how we could everybody be helping to reach the better future as you described? I'm not sure if you understand what I'm asking, but but shortly, practicalities.
Helena, you have a good question, valid question, and this is something that we've been working for quite a while. We see some very practical, if not solutions, but elements for a solution, and because it's not going to be just one single solution. We have in our history a lot of experience of single item ideas, and they never deliver all of it. But we have identified a number of initiatives that could be put forward. And one of the most important parts is actually, from the rural perspective, the assessment of the value chains. How do we consider this, and how does that relate to the added value that the rural economy, rural operators, farmers, forest owners, small and medium-sized businesses or micro enterprises in rural economy would actually benefit from? We have some good initiatives from the Commission already a few years ago. Previous Agriculture Commissioner, Mr. Hogan, came up with an initiative outside, in fact, of the Commission working program to initiate unfair trading practices directive. And this is important because some of you may know that I have been a bit of an advocate in my own Etelä-Savo region when it comes to the retail sector, promoting agriculture and forest, and especially from the same territory. I'm not the most popular person amongst our consumer cooperative movement, which I'm a member of. But then the reality is that the value chains need to be reassessed. And in this respect, we agree with the Commissioner Wojciechowski, also in agriculture, that we need to take a look into how the rural economy and the value chains would operate, and how this would be taken into account in the economy in a wider sense. So we need to rebalance the value chain, taking into account the added value that those, especially rural jobs, would deliver. And that means assessing, for instance, competition policy or the way we trade in general. And we have been very active in this over the past few years. Then also, if I put parallel to this, we have some specific issues that I know that are controversial. But for instance, our genetic materials, irrespective whether it's conventional agriculture, whether it's plant side, animals, organic, or any other form of agricultural activity where we have living organisms, we need to talk about our genetic material. And that needs to be improved. And this time it needs to be improved much quicker than what we have had in the past 100 years, where European Union, and in fact, Finland also, is very successful. We are still the champions of this genetic improvement, because that would be the safest option in general to go for the resilience and responding also to the consumer needs. Look at our fruits, look at our crops. They are completely different what we have had 100 years ago. And most of our consumers wouldn't even eat some of the crops and fruit and vegetables that we had 100 years ago. So we have a multitude of elements also in areas such as technology, but I would underline the importance of the value chain.